I've done a lot of hiking in my life, but nothing like this has ever happened before. I feel like I'm still shaking from it, even though it's been days. We were just supposed to be out for a few hours, a quick loop trail, nothing special, but somehow everything went wrong. It started with us getting off trail. We kept going over the map, checking our route, convinced we'd find our way back any second. But somehow the forest kept looking more and more unfamiliar. Before we knew it, night had crept in. By the time we found the hut, we were exhausted and soaked from an unexpected drizzle that quickly turned into a storm. The place looked ancient, like it had been abandoned for years. Moss and vines covered the outside, windows shattered, and the wooden beams groaned with each gust of wind. None of us really wanted to stay there, but with no other option, we took shelter. Inside, we found some old candles tucked away in a cabinet and lit them up, hoping they'd last us through the night. At first, things were quiet, just the sound of rain pelting the roof, each gust of wind rattling the old walls. We settled down as best we could, trying to make the place feel even remotely safe. Then, just as we'd started to calm down, the wind picked up violently, slamming the door open. The blast of cold air blew out all the candles, plunging us into absolute darkness. Then we heard a slow, heavy creak, like footsteps echoing across the floorboards. At first we thought it was one of us moving around in the dark, but the sounds were coming from all around, circling us. We whispered to each other, trying to figure out who was where, but every time someone answered, it sounded like the footsteps came from somewhere else. Just when I thought it couldn't get worse, a bolt of lightning lit up the room, and for a split second I saw something. It was crouched near the wall, limbs stretched and thin, almost spider-like, but not quite. In that flash of light I could make out long fingers curled, and its eyes glinting, staring directly at us. The darkness swallowed us up again before anyone else could see it, and the silence broken only by our breathing and the sound of something skittering just beyond reach. The next moment, there was a flurry of movement. Something shot out from the shadows, grabbing one of my friends. I heard him struggle, scream, then a thud as he hit the floor. There was nothing but darkness, the sounds of fighting, bodies hitting the wooden planks. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I scrambled toward where I thought the door was, shoving my way through, my hands scraping against splintered wood, fingers slipping on the rain-slick floor. In the confusion, I heard my friends' voices, panicked, calling out. But one by one they fell silent, leaving just the sound of something scraping across the boards. Somehow I managed to find the door and burst outside into the storm. I ran, stumbling and slipping on the muddy ground, barely able to see in the pitch dark. I don't even know how far I ran. I just kept going until my legs couldn't take it anymore. When I finally reached safety the next morning, I tried to explain what had happened, but every time I start, people just look at me like I'm crazy. They've gone out to search for my friends, but there's been no trace of them. This happened last weekend, and I'm still trying to make sense of it. A few friends and I decided to go camping in the woods just outside town. It was supposed to be a fun night, just the five of us, a few drinks and a lot of laughs. Luke, one of my best friends, was with us, and he was supposed to be the life of the party, as usual. He'd been cracking jokes all night, and around the campfire we asked him to tell us a scary story. He stood up, laughed, and said he'd need to step into the woods first to set the mood. We all rolled our eyes and watched him wander off with his flashlight, disappearing into the trees. A few minutes later, my phone started buzzing. It was a call from Luke. I thought he was trying to prank us, so I answered, laughing and asking if he'd gotten lost already, but there was this weird pause on the other end. I heard Luke's voice, but he sounded groggy, like he'd just woken up. He said he was home, sick in bed. It was obvious he had no idea what I was talking about when I mentioned the camping trip. I didn't understand at first and thought it was some kind of elaborate joke, but he kept insisting he wasn't with us. My heart started to pound. While I was still on the phone, the other Luke came back into the circle of firelight, smiling and acting like nothing was wrong. The rest of the group didn't notice my expression, but I was frozen, looking between my phone and him, trying to process it all. One of the others, noticing my look, asked what was going on, so I put the phone on speaker. The real Luke, who sounded as bewildered as I felt, said he was still home, too sick to even get out of bed, let alone come camping. The imposter, Luke, standing in front of us, cocked his head, almost like he was trying to understand what we were saying. Slowly, he started to smile wide, stretching across his face in a way that made my skin crawl. That grin got bigger and bigger, and then he laughed. this laugh that didn't sound human at all. It echoed, hollow and strange, like it was coming from deep inside his chest, as though he were trying to mimic laughter without ever having done it before. Then, in the span of a blink, he just faded, right there, in front of us. One moment he was standing there, the next he was gone, like he'd never been there in the first place, and none of us could process it. We all sat there in silence for a beat, too shocked to move, and then everyone started screaming and grabbing their stuff, scrambling to get away from the camp. We didn't even bother putting out the fire. We just bolted, running as fast as we could back to the road. We piled into the car and sped off, leaving the campsite behind, our heads spinning. When we got back, I called the real Luke just to make sure he was okay, and he was safe and sound at home, still completely baffled by everything I'd told him. I don't know if I'll ever go hiking again after what happened last weekend. It was supposed to be a fun trip, just a weekend in the woods with some friends. I'm experienced enough to know how to plan a safe route, and we'd chosen a quiet, out-of-the-way spot so we wouldn't run into anyone else. The trail was remote, no official campsites nearby, but that was exactly what we were looking for. Peace, seclusion, and a night under the stars. Everything started out fine. We arrived early, hiked for a few hours, and by dusk found a small clearing by a river where we set up camp. It was perfect, no sounds of traffic, no other hikers around, just us and the forest. We set up our tents, got a fire going, and spent the evening telling stories and cooking over the flames. Around midnight we all headed to bed, excited to do more exploring the next day. The next morning things started to go wrong. We noticed one of the trail markers we'd set up was missing. It was just a little orange flag we'd tied to a branch to help guide us back, but it was gone. We figured it must have fallen or blown away, so we put up a new one, but as we kept going, more markers seemed to disappear, each one we'd placed gone without a trace. Later, we spotted something that set us all on edge. From the corner of my eye, I saw someone moving between the trees. Just a flicker of movement, too quick to make out any details, but it was enough to make me freeze. I asked the others if they saw it too, and a couple of them nodded, looking as uneasy as I felt. We told ourselves it was probably a random hiker who happened to pass by, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was had been watching us. We decided to stay vigilant, sticking close together and marking our path carefully, but every few hours we'd find that our markers were still going missing. No matter how many times we stopped and placed new ones, they'd vanish. The weirdest part was they were being removed quietly. We didn't hear anyone following us, didn't see any signs of another person near our camp, yet every time we checked, another marker was gone. By dusk, we were exhausted and frustrated, but we found a decent spot to camp again, so we decided to stay the night. As we set up, one of my friends pointed out something in the distance, just beyond the tree line. There was the figure, standing perfectly still, watching us. He was too far away to see clearly, but the sight of him sent a chill through the group. Whoever it was, he was dressed in what looked like old, worn-out clothes that blended into the forest, making him seem like part of the landscape. He stayed there for what felt like an eternity, just staring. We tried calling out, but he didn't respond, didn't move, didn't do anything but watch. Finally, one of my friends suggested we pack up and leave immediately, but by now it was getting dark and leaving would mean a long hike through the woods at night in a place we were already struggling to navigate. We decided to stay put, hoping he'd lose interest. That night was the longest night of my life. Every sound, every rustle outside the tent put us all on edge. We whispered about what we'd seen, trying to come up with a rational explanation, but nothing added up. Around midnight, just when we'd started to calm down, we heard footsteps, slow steps, crunching the leaves outside. None of us dared to move. It was like whoever was out there wanted us to know he was close, circling our camp, taking his time. Eventually the steps faded, but none of us slept. We stayed huddled in the tents until dawn, hearts pounding, straining to hear if he'd come back. At first light, we broke camp and tried to find our way back to the trail. That's when we noticed something truly disturbing. Just outside our campsite, arranged in a rough circle, were our missing markers. Every single one, tied back up in the branches as if someone had been collecting them, leaving them for us to find, but they were placed much higher than any of us could reach, almost as if they'd been taunting us, mocking our attempt to find our way out. We scrambled to leave, following any semblance of a trail we could find. But every time we thought we were getting close to the main path, we'd end up back at that same spot, where we'd seen the figure the night before. By then we knew he was leading us in circles, making sure we couldn't leave. It was as if he was guiding us, pushing us back into the forest, keeping us trapped. After hours of trying to escape, we finally stumbled out onto a familiar trail, practically collapsing in relief. We practically ran back to the car, too terrified to look back. Only when we were safely on the road did we feel we could breathe again. I don't know if anyone else has had a similar experience in those woods, but I hope no one ever has to go through what we did. If you ever find yourself hiking somewhere remote, keep a close eye on your trail markers. We were a group of 4 friends looking for a remote spot to set up camp. Nothing fancy, just a quiet place in the forest far from other campers. We'd been on trails before, but this time we wanted something more isolated, so we picked a spot near an overgrown path, way off from where anyone usually hiked. The woods were dense, so it was late afternoon by the time we found a flat patch of earth to pitch the tent. There was nothing obviously wrong with the place, maybe a few odd-looking stones poking out of the ground, but we ignored them. It was easy to set up, and soon enough we had a fire going and everything felt fine. That first night we stayed up until around midnight, laughing and telling stories until we drifted off to sleep. But not long after, I was jolted awake by this low scraping sound, almost like something dragging through gravel or brushing against the tent's canvas. I tried telling myself it was an animal or the wind, but the sound didn't stop, it just grew louder. As it went on, I started to get this intense feeling that something was waiting right outside. And it wasn't just me. By the time I sat up, I realized everyone else was awake too. We all lay there, frozen in silence, listening. Finally, we convinced ourselves to go outside, hoping that we'd find a raccoon or maybe a branch that fell on the tent, but the clearing was empty. Nothing moved in the shadows around us, and the ground was untouched, even though the sound had been so close, almost like it was inside the tent itself. When we crawled back inside, I tried to shake off the feeling that something was watching us, but the night didn't let us rest. Just as I was about to fall asleep again, I saw a face, or maybe the shadow of one, flash before my eyes. It was the face of an old man, wrinkled and staring straight at me, his mouth open, silently mouthing something. I bolted upright, but when I looked around, there was nothing. Just my friends, who were all asleep, or so I thought. But the others started stirring. They each looked pale and shaken, and without even having to say anything, I knew they'd seen the same thing. One of my friends whispered that she'd seen the face too, only it had spoken to her. It kept saying, "Help me find my bones," repeating it over and over. She thought it was a dream, but it felt too real. Over the next few hours, each of us heard or saw something that night, and the visions became more intense as the night dragged on. There were whispers outside the tent, like someone was pacing around the perimeter, and we kept hearing the same thing. "Find my bones." I tried to ignore it, but the voice grew desperate, more demanding, as if the unseen figure was somehow in pain, pleading. None of us dared to look outside after that, too terrified to move, but that didn't stop the nightmares. Just before dawn, the visions became impossible to ignore. The face appeared again, but this time I could see him more clearly. His skin looked pale, sagging off his bones, and his eyes were hollow, staring straight into me. He repeated the words again, a voice like gravel scraping out a hollow demand. "Find my bones before the sun rises." Then one by one, we all started feeling something beneath us. A few feet from where we lay, we began to notice the faint outline of what looked like a shallow trench just outside the tent. The ground felt uneven, almost like it was sinking, but none of us could muster the courage to step outside. My heart was racing, pounding so loudly I thought I was going to pass out. By the time dawn was creeping in, we realized there was no way we could stay there another second. As soon as we could make out the trees in the early light, we scrambled out of the tent. We packed as fast as we could, almost tripping over each other. Just before we left, my friend stumbled on something sticking out of the ground near where we'd pitched the tent. It was a bone, half buried in the soil, a large one, definitely human. And there were more, scattered shallowly beneath the surface, as if someone had tried to cover them but hadn't bothered to bury them properly. We didn't stay to find out how many there were. We hiked back to the trail without looking back. None of us said a word, too afraid to process what we'd seen. As we drove away, I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see that face staring back at me from the woods. Since we've been back, none of us have really talked about it, but I can't shake the feeling that the old man isn't finished with us. My friend Jenna and I had planned a quick weekend trip to this remote campsite, just the two of us. The first night was great. Clear skies, quiet woods, just the kind of peaceful break we both needed. We stayed up talking for hours, finally crashing around midnight. I remember falling asleep to the sounds of the forest, everything perfectly still. At some point during the night, I woke up feeling suddenly alone. I rolled over, expecting to see Jenna, but her sleeping bag was empty. I called her name, expecting her to be right outside the tent, but there was no answer. It was like she'd vanished without a trace. Her shoes were gone, but her jacket and flashlight were still lying beside her pack. I crawled out of the tent, calling her name, expecting her to answer any second. The woods around me were so quiet, and something about that silence made me feel small, like I was somewhere I shouldn't be. I grabbed my flashlight and started looking, circling further and further from the tent, trying not to panic, but she was just gone. For hours I searched. I kept hoping I'd see her coming back through the trees, or maybe find her sitting somewhere, laughing at me for being so worried. But by dawn I was exhausted, fighting this feeling of dread, wondering if I should head back to the car and get help. Just as I was about to give up, I saw her stumbling toward me from between the trees, eyes wide and unfocused, moving in this eerie, slow way, almost like she was sleepwalking. I ran over to her, grabbing her shoulders, but she just blinked at me, looking disoriented, like she had no idea where she was or how she got there. Her clothes were damp and her hair tangled, but she didn't have any injuries. She kept asking what was going on, completely confused, swearing that she had no memory of leaving the tent. In fact, she insisted she had just woken up there, with no idea why I was acting so frantic. The whole thing left me uneasy, but she seemed unharmed, just tired and dazed, so we packed up and left. The whole drive back she was quiet, staring out the window, occasionally rubbing her arms like she was cold. She didn't seem like herself, almost like something had drained her. Since we've been back, things have only gotten weirder. She's called me a few times in the middle of the night, saying she's had strange dreams about being in the woods, hearing voices calling her name, whispering things she can't quite understand. She told me she started sleepwalking, waking up in different rooms, sometimes with dirt on her hands and feet. Her memory from that night is still blank, but it's like whatever happened didn't end when we left the campsite. I haven't camped much since this happened, and honestly, I don't think I ever will again, so a few friends and I went camping at a remote spot in the mountains, a place where you won't see another soul for days, and that's exactly why we picked it. We spent the whole day hiking, setting up our tents and getting a fire going. It was the perfect getaway. No phone service, no noise, just us and the forest. It was dark when he showed up. We were sitting around the fire making jokes, roasting marshmallows, when this ranger suddenly walked into the glow of our campfire. No footsteps, no sound, just appeared like he'd stepped out of nowhere. He looked like a regular ranger. He was tall, probably in his 50s, with a thick moustache and an old-school ranger's hat that looked slightly worn. But it wasn't his appearance that unsettled me, it was his behavior. The first thing he did was look at our campfire, almost as if he was sizing it up. Then he glanced around at each of us in a way that made me feel exposed, like he was analyzing us one by one. When he asked if we had water and a shovel nearby for the fire, we all nodded and laughed, telling him we were careful campers. But he didn't seem convinced. He went on about how dangerous fires could be, that you can never be too careful out here, and he stared at the fire as he spoke. It was intense, like he was holding back something he desperately wanted to say. After a while, we were getting uncomfortable, and I think he picked up on it because he took a step back. He just said, "Be safe with the fire." You don't know what could happen. He walked away from our campsite, disappearing into the darkness, and we could hear him muttering to himself until his voice faded. The next morning, we figured it was just a weird encounter. Rangers can be intense after all, and maybe he was just trying to be responsible. We packed up and decided to check out a nearby lake before heading back. There was a ranger station on the way, so we figured we'd stop in and mention the guy who'd come to our site the night before, just in case he wanted to know. Inside the station, it was empty, and honestly, it looked like no one had used it in years. Dust was on the countertops, and there was this stale smell in the air. But what really caught our attention was this old, framed photograph hanging on the wall. The man in the picture was unmistakably the same ranger who had been at our camp the night before, only the plaque below the photo said something strange. It marked his death. It read, "In memory of Ranger Tom Grayson, who lost his life saving campers from a wildfire, 1982. We all stared at the photo in shock, not sure what to make of it. The photo showed a younger version of the man we'd seen, but it was clearly him. One of my friends asked if we should talk to someone, maybe see if another ranger was around, but no one seemed to be working there. The station was deserted, so we left, trying to laugh it off as we hiked back down the trail. But as we walked, we started noticing signs of an old fire, charred trees and patches of land where nothing had grown back, even after what had to be decades. As we got closer to our original campsite to pack up, we noticed something even stranger. The fire pit we'd used was filled with damp ashes, like someone had poured water over it multiple times. None of us had touched the fire since we'd put it out that morning. We all stood there, staring at it, feeling this chill that had nothing to do with the forest. We packed up and left as fast as we could. Even as we made our way back down the trail, I kept feeling like someone was following us. Every so often I thought I caught glimpses of that ranger in the distance, just a shadow against the trees, but each time I turned around to get a better look, there was no one there. When I got home, I tried to find more information about Ranger Tom Grayson. There were a few articles, mostly from local papers, talking about a wildfire that had killed him while he was rescuing a group of campers who had left a fire smoldering. The articles were vague, but the details lined up: the remote spot, the burned-out trees we'd seen, and the warning about the dangers of campfires. I don't know who or what we saw that night, but I have no doubt it was him, or some part of him still tied to that forest, still obsessed with keeping campers safe from fire. It's like he never really left the forest, like he's still out there, checking on every campfire, making sure no one else makes the mistake that cost him his life. This happened to me at a summer camp when I was 12. It was one of those classic overnight camps with cabins lined up in rows, bunk beds, and a big lake out back. I remember being excited because it was the first time I'd ever spent a week away from home, totally free from parents and familiar faces. I was assigned to cabin 6, along with a handful of other kids my age. We didn't know each other, but we got along well enough. The counselors told us stories around the campfire every night, usually the typical escaped convict in the woods kind of tales. It was all fun and games until the 4th night. I went to bed feeling exhausted after a long day of activities, and I remember drifting off almost immediately. But sometime in the middle of the night I started hearing this faint noise, like breathing. I figured it was one of the other kids, maybe snoring or moving around, so I ignored it and tried to go back to sleep. But as I lay there, the sound grew louder. I could swear it was coming from the bed right next to mine. The thing was, that bed had been empty since the first day. It was meant for a kid who'd never shown up, so the counselors just left it made up, sheets tucked in tight, the way it had been since we'd arrived. The kid's name had been Tim, I think, but he'd never made it to camp, and no one had really talked about him after the first day. I kept my eyes closed and tried to fall back asleep, but the sound of breathing wouldn't stop. It wasn't just regular breathing either. It had this strange quality to it, almost like whoever was making the sound was struggling. Like each breath took effort. My mind was racing. I thought maybe one of the kids had moved over there as a prank, but I was too scared to look. I stayed there, barely moving, my blanket pulled up over my head. Then I started hearing a different sound. This one was softer, like the gentle shift of sheets, like someone adjusting in their bed. At that point, I told myself it had to be a prank. I decided I'd wait it out and tell everyone I'd figured out their joke in the morning, but as I lay there, I heard the sound of sheets moving. I finally worked up the courage to peek over my blanket, just enough to see. The sheets on that bed were moving, the outline of a shape underneath, like someone lying there. It wasn't just the sheets shifting, though. They were actually rising and falling in rhythm with the breathing. But there was no one there. It was like an invisible body was lying under the blankets, breathing in and out. I felt this chill crawl up my spine, and I immediately looked away, squeezing my eyes shut, trying to convince myself I hadn't seen it. Then the breathing got louder, raspier. I could feel this faint vibration through the floor, almost like something heavy, shifting weight. I lay there, gripping the edge of my mattress, terrified. My brain kept telling me it had to be a prank, but I couldn't imagine any of the kids in my cabin pulling something this elaborate. And then the worst part happened. I heard a creak, the sound of someone getting up from the bed. My heart was racing, and I felt frozen in place. I couldn't hear breathing anymore, but I could feel something near me. I had that sense you get when someone's standing right beside you, close enough that you can almost feel the space they occupy. I stayed like that for what felt like an hour, just waiting for whatever it was to go away. Finally, I managed to fall back asleep somehow, too exhausted to stay awake. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight streaming through the cabin window, the other kids talking and laughing like nothing had happened. I tried to act normal, but that empty bed, it was perfectly made, sheets tucked tight as if no one had touched it. I didn't know what to say, so I kept quiet, but the entire day I was on edge, glancing back at that bed, trying to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, a nightmare that had carried over. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, straining to hear any sound. It was around midnight when I heard it again, the breathing, steady and heavy. This time, I didn't look. I knew what I'd see, and I couldn't bear it. I kept my eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, but then I started hearing whispers. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like someone mumbling, low and hoarse. The voice was close, like it was right by my ear. I kept telling myself it wasn't real, that it was just my imagination. But it went on, just out of reach, like it was trying to tell me something. I don't know how I made it through the rest of the week. The breathing and shifting kept happening every night like clockwork. The shape under the sheets would move, sometimes closer, sometimes shifting back. I didn't tell anyone about it, partly because I didn't want to sound crazy, and partly because I was afraid that acknowledging it would somehow make it worse. When camp ended, I went home, relieved to be away from that cabin. But the last night still haunts me. Just before we left, I had woken up one more time in the middle of the night. There was a moment of silence, and I thought maybe, just maybe, it was over. Then I heard something by my ear, closer than ever before, a rasping, dry whisper, just 2 words. I still don't know what it meant, but I've never forgotten it. Find me. This was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. My friends and I had planned this camping trip for months, just a couple of days away from the chaos of our lives, camping by the lake, getting away from it all. The lake itself was perfect, silent, ringed by dense trees with a sandy shore where we set up our tents and a fire pit. We were so far out there that we didn't even get phone signal, which just added to the appeal. The first day was normal enough. We spent hours setting up our tents and starting a small fire to cook dinner. The lake was unbelievably calm, the surface flat as glass. But the stillness gave it an eerie quality, and as the day went on, it became clear that the lake wasn't as empty as it first seemed. Around dusk, we started noticing small ripples on the water, even though there wasn't a single breeze. The air was dead still. The surface of the lake would ripple as if something just below it were moving. At first, we chalked it up to fish or currents, maybe even underwater springs or something. None of us are experts on lakes, but as we sat around the fire that night, we heard a sound, a faint splashing out on the lake. It was odd because we hadn't seen any signs of wildlife, and the water was too shallow near the shore for anything big. It was as if someone was standing just beneath the surface, moving back and forth. Shadows seemed to shift and deepen out there in the moonlight. It wasn't until late that night, well after midnight, that things got worse. I woke up in my tent to a noise that I couldn't quite place. It was this soft, wet, slapping sound, like something soft hitting the sand. I told myself it was one of my friends stumbling around after too many drinks, tried to get back to sleep, but curiosity got the better of me. I peeked out of my tent flap. The shore looked empty, and the lake was still. But then I noticed the sand near our tents. There were these damp, smudged patches leading away from the water, forming a faint trail up the beach like footprints. They were wide, and the shapes were wrong. They looked almost human, but spread out, with strange, uneven shapes around the edges. I crept out, my eyes darting to the lake, half expecting to see someone standing there, but it was as calm as before. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe some animal tracks or a weird effect from previous night of rain, even though we hadn't had any rain. I didn't mention it to the others when we all woke up in the morning, but I noticed that I wasn't the only one looking out at the lake a little warily. Throughout the next day, we kept seeing those strange ripples, almost circling in certain spots. Every now and then, we'd catch movement beneath the water, a shadow shifting just out of sight, too deep to see clearly, like something large gliding silently through the depths. That night, the atmosphere was tense. We all kept glancing at the lake. unable to shake this sense of something lurking just beneath the surface. When the splashing started again, it was louder this time. Then the shadows came back, swirling deeper in the water, more active now. It was when we decided to call it a night that things really started getting strange. I crawled back into my tent, zipped myself in tight, but I was restless, straining to hear any sounds from outside. It was only a few minutes later that I heard that same soft slapping noise again, that wet, dragging sound coming closer. This time I didn't dare look out. I lay there, listening, as the sounds drew closer to the tent, pausing right outside. I held my breath, straining to hear anything. It was dead silent for a moment, then I heard it. A soft, low splatter, almost as if something wet was pressing against the fabric of my tent, and then a dragging, sliding sound, like something moving against the tent walls. I forced myself not to make a sound, lying as still as possible. The next morning we all shared a look, silently acknowledging that none of us had slept well. When we walked outside, we found more of those strange, wet marks. This time all around the tent, smudged and smeared, as if something had been pacing around while we slept. But the worst part, there were handprints. Huge, muddy impressions streaked across the sand near the water, dragging trails leading back down into the lake, as if whatever had left them had crawled out, then slid back into the water. One of my friends finally cracked and suggested we leave early, and none of us argued. We started packing up as quickly as we could, constantly looking over our shoulders at the lake. But just as we were almost ready to leave, one of us spotted it. Something dark and elongated, barely visible just beneath the water's surface, circling slowly, too close to shore. It was huge, and it moved with this smooth, fluid motion as though gliding silently. As we scrambled to leave, the splashing started again, louder and more frantic. We sprinted to the car, shoving our things inside, not looking back. Even as we drove away, I could have sworn I saw a shape, standing at the water's edge, staring after us with no face, just a blurred form dripping lake water onto the sand.